These 3 kids and an 11-month-old baby survived, all alone, in the world's deadliest jungle for 40 days. Laylee, Soleini, Tien, and baby Kristen were flying with their mother Magdalena over the Amazon rainforest when their small charter plane began to lose power. Their pilot, Hernando Morales, notified air traffic control of their emergency, but decided not to make an emergency landing. This was a strange decision from a pilot as seasoned as Morales. However, it seemed he was confident that he could get the flight back under control, which, miraculously, he did. And somehow the engine did regain power. But even so, this decision to forego an emergency landing would prove to be a fatal mistake. After what may have been less than an hour, the engine started to fail a second time, prompting them to signal their emergency to air control again.
Mayday! 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 2803! 2803! I'm going to look for a river. I have a river on the right.
That was the last thing anyone ever heard from Hernando Morales. Laylee recalled how when she regained consciousness after the crash, she found herself pinned underneath her mother and siblings' bodies. The smell of metal and dirt filled her nostrils as she noticed that almost everything inside the plane was turned upside down and she was lying on the back of the pilot's seat. As Laylee crawled out from the pile, the first thing she noticed was her sister's leg moving. She pulled Soleini closer to her, and after checking over her other siblings, she was glad that they were all mostly unharmed. But her mother was a completely different story. Unlike the children, she was in incredible pain, and worst of all, she couldn't move. It was a horrible sight to see her mother like that, and it seemed like her mother was struggling not to cry. After Laylee reassured her mother that she and her siblings were fine, her mother called out for the pilot. Captain Morales knew everything about flying, so surely he'd know what they had to do next. Except the pilot wasn't responding, and upon further exploration of the plane, Laylee would discover that he had died in the crash. Knowing they couldn't stay inside, the children wriggled their way out of the wreckage, only to find themselves in the middle of the Amazon forest. They were surrounded by gigantic trees in all directions, with no clear way out. Magdalena wanted to do more to protect her children, but her injuries prevented her from leaving the wreckage. She knew that they weren't safe if they continued staying by the plane. The corpses in the wreckage were going to attract predatory animals that neither Magdalena nor the children were capable of fending off. And if her children were lucky enough to survive the crash, maybe they would be able to find their way out of the jungle. Weakly, Magdalena called for her children to gather around her by the airplane. She needed to protect them one last time. "Maybe you should go," she told them as she gave a tearful smile. When Magdalena passed away hours later, there was nothing but grief left for the children. They didn't want to leave. After all, where would they go? Yet Laylee understood what their mother was trying to do. They couldn't risk staying, especially with Kristen potentially attracting more danger with her cries. Laylee needed to find help as soon as possible. Still, the reality wasn't just that they were lost in the jungle. They were lost without their mother. And how were 3 kids and an infant supposed to survive on their own in the world's deadliest jungle? After losing contact with the children's plane, air traffic control had no way of knowing where it could have crashed. The children and their mother had been en route to Laylee's stepfather, Tien and Kristen's biological father, Manuel Renoki, an indigenous leader of the Witoto tribe and a governor over the tribe's reserves in Puerto Sabalo, Colombia. He had been hiding in Bogotá, the country's capital, for months after men from a drug trafficking rebel group known as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, had threatened to kill him for control over the area. So, fearing for their safety, Magdalena decided she and the children had to reunite with him. The only problem was, the family was separated by miles and miles of the Amazon rainforest, and now they crashed somewhere in the middle of it. There was the ELT, or Emergency Locator Transmitter, which relayed GPS data of where the plane roughly was after a crash. But there was a huge downside to the ELT. It could only transmit that data every 12 hours. And it only had a lifespan of 2 days. There was some good news at least. The Civil Aviation Authority of Colombia picked up the plane's distress signals, and as soon as they lost contact with the plane, the Aviation Authority's Search and Rescue Service immediately arranged for help from the military and Air Force in hopes of locating the plane and retrieving any survivors. General Pedro Sanchez was appointed as the leader for the operation. He was commander of Colombia's Special Operations Joint Command, the only group that was capable of navigating the Amazon. And once he heard that there were children on that flight, he decided that as long as there was even the smallest chance that any of them had survived, he would be determined to find them and return them to their families. Little did the general know, everything was going to be stacked against him. The Colombian military had plenty of advantages. They were equipped with radar, and the data they got from the plane's ELT helped them chart every possible place the plane could have landed on a grid. Howard, could you calculate how large of a search area the military had to cover?
Calculation complete. The estimated search coverage is 132 square miles. But for your inferior organic processes, that is approximately the size of the entire city of Philadelphia.
Thank you, Howard. Finding the plane would certainly have been an easier task if it was in some place like Philadelphia. But the green hellscape of the Amazon jungle complicated things. The searchers began by using helicopters to search for the most obvious signs of a plane crash: smoke, broken tree lines, and naturally, a downed plane, things that a helicopter could easily spot. However, it was the wet season in the already humid biome of the Amazon. And on top of that, somehow, as they would later find out, the plane hadn't caught on fire after it crashed. But it wasn't just the lack of fire that made it difficult either. The trees in the Amazon forest were incredibly huge in comparison to the tiny plane, with the canopy reaching as high as 100 feet. Even with helicopters flying overhead, the plane would have been completely obscured by foliage. So for General Sanchez's search team of about 90 men, their only option would be to go through the jungle on foot. There were dangerous animals in the Amazon Bean, and the military search group was ready to face them during the operation. But that would turn out to be the least of the search team's problems. Mr. Renoki and Magdalena's parents were immediately alerted of the plane crash by authorities, and their indigenous community began a search of their own. Mr. Renoki visited a man living in the jungle who had apparently seen the plane fly over his hut. Based on the man's information, Mr. Renoki led his own group of indigenous volunteers towards where the plane had been headed. As for the children's grandparents, their community reached out to the Indigenous Guard, local spiritual protectors of the Amazon rainforest, a place that was sacred to their tribes. And once they heard about the missing mother and children, they set out to work with Mr. Renoki's group to find them. There was just one problem. The military declined their help. But undiscouraged, the Indigenous Guard started their own search operation, even if it meant they had to do it without the resources provided to the official military rescue team. They were determined to find the lost family with nothing but their traditional techniques, their willpower, and their machetes. From the outside, it did look like the military was being unreasonable for not wanting more manpower in their search, but it was not really about whether the Guard's spiritual approach to finding the missing plane would bring results. It was actually what the military had discovered that made them believe it was too risky for civilians to get involved. The first week of the search was critical. If anyone had survived the crash, they would also be at risk of encountering predators. The Amazon had jaguars, boas, and piranhas, and what's worse is the area they were trekking through was completely uncharted. It was virgin jungle. You look in any direction and all you see are huge trees. It's very easy to get lost, said Alfredo Acosta, an indigenous volunteer working with the Indigenous Guard. So by the 9th day of the search, when the military found an abandoned camp, the soldiers knew something was wrong. There wasn't supposed to be anyone in the jungle, and more concerning, it didn't seem to belong to anyone from the missing plane or the rogue Indigenous Guard. Instead, it had come from the very people who had driven Magdalena and the children to flee from their home and end up in this mess in the first place. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. No one was sure how they got there, but finding just one of their abandoned camps spelled even more danger to anyone involved in the search operation, as it meant they were not the only ones searching for the children, and this group was not trying to rescue them. But in a stroke of luck, there was one good thing that the military did find. By the morning of May 15th, one of the soldiers saw something strange in the distance. It had already been 2 weeks of searching, and both the soldiers and the indigenous volunteers started to wonder if maybe the jungle had truly swallowed the small plane and its passengers. But things changed that day, when the soldier found a clue that later led General Sanchez to believe deeply in what he was doing: a pink baby bottle. There was the possibility that the bottle had belonged to someone else. But once military sent photos of it to the children's grandmother, Fatima, she recognized it as baby Kristen's. And that wasn't all. There was one more detail that gave hope to the desperate searchers that perhaps the passengers of the missing plane were still alive. It was what was inside the bottle that renewed their hope. Baby Kristen was still too small and her hands too weak for her to cap and uncap her nursing bottle. And yet, it was clear this had been done after the crash. Searchers had expected to see baby formula still in the bottle, but instead of milk inside, there was cloudy water. Water that looked like it had come from the Amazon, which meant someone else must have filled the bottle for her. At least 2 people had survived the crash, and they were going to do everything they could to bring them home. There was just one issue. If they didn't find the survivors soon, Kristen, and whoever was with her, would more than likely die. The news on the baby bottles spread amongst both the military and the indigenous searchers, fueling their drive to find the children and bring them home. Upon further investigation of the area, they found half-eaten fruits nearby with human bite marks, more proof that the children must have survived. Their grandparents pressed General Sanchez and his men to let their indigenous group search with them. With renewed hope in the survival of the children, General Sanchez chose to begin a collaboration with the Indigenous Guard, making it the first joint operation between the Colombian military and the advocacy group. It was a controversial move, given that the 2 groups had a history of violent conflicts between them. We as indigenous people know how to navigate the jungle and understand the unique spirits of each territory, said the children's great-uncle, Fidencio Valencia. The general believed the same of the Indigenous Guard. He believed they needed to use any means necessary to find baby Kristen and her siblings, and so General Sanchez directed the Guard to search in the area opposite the soldiers, a move that unexpectedly led to the searchers finding something vital to the search. Now, even though the Indigenous Guard weren't as well equipped as the Colombian military, their members weren't your average civilians either. A lot of Colombia is urbanized, but unlike the soldiers who were mostly from those areas, members of the Guard often lived in or close to the jungle, and that lifestyle gave them the experience they needed to persevere during the search. They would hunt and fish for food, and pick herbs and fruits for energy, removing the need to constantly resupply while they were in the Amazon. The members of the Guard also knew how to track prints, which helped them avoid encounters with dangerous animals. But their survival skills weren't the only things that the Indigenous Guard brought to the table. Before they entered the rainforest, they performed a sacred ceremony where they consumed ambil, a black paste from the tobacco plant, and mambe, a green powder made from the coca plant. It was a necessity for the operation. To them, the jungle was the realm of the spirits, and they needed to ask the spirits of the Amazon for permission to enter and retrieve the children. And to their surprise, it seemed to them as if the spirits actually responded. Once the Guard arrived in the forest, they noticed that a number of insects started to flock towards them, and to their understanding, it was the spirits of the Amazon inhabiting them to see what was going on. However, according to the men, the spirits didn't just visit them that way. Upon the first day of arriving in the jungle, a lot of the Guard started getting extremely sick. They had flu-like symptoms and experienced crippling pain that shot through their bones, while many of them also lost their voices. The spirit of the jungle gave us a fever, explained Eliezer Munoz, a member of the Indigenous Guard whose brother and father disappeared in the Amazon decades before. He claimed that it didn't matter how well equipped the soldiers were to find those kids. Once they entered the Amazon, they could never comprehend or see the jungle's spirits. And as much of a skeptic as I am, I have to admit that what happened the night the Guard arrived was strange. They had just finished the first day of searching and were settling down to camp for the night. The men gathered around the campfire some time after they had eaten when they noticed something was wrong. The forest, which was constantly alive with a cacophony of sounds, felt dead quiet. It didn't seem natural at all. The Guard knew they had to stay alert until a sharp scream rang through the forest, cutting through the stillness of the night. In their confusion, the men looked for the source in the distance, and they found a bright white light blazing through the trees. It was the spirits, they thought, and they were angry. The men knew they had to stay alert for whatever was to come. And then, a heavy branch fell right onto the camp. To them, the message was clear. They were not welcome, and it seemed that the Amazon wanted them to leave, except the Indigenous Guard stayed. They were going to find the children, and more importantly, they were going to bring the children home. Because we claim them, because they are children of our blood, said Eliezer Munoz, one of the volunteer Indigenous searchers. And when the soldiers in the Guard finally started to work together, they would find what they were looking for, something blue in the foliage. It was the missing plane. Finally, they could put an end to this whole ordeal and bring these kids home. In celebration, Colombia's President Gustavo Petro posted a tweet saying that the search was over and that the rescue was a joy for the country. But just hours later, the president would delete the post and apologize. After their mother died, Layli, being the oldest, took charge and decided to follow the setting sun, hoping that if they traveled westward, they would eventually find their way out of the Amazon. They brought with them whatever they could carry from the plane crash: a flashlight, Kristen's remaining baby formula, some diapers, a heavy bag of cassava flour, a mosquito net, and a pair of dull scissors. It wasn't much for the elements of the forest, though, and Laylee knew it. So before leaving the plane, she ripped fabric from their mother's clothes in order to cover her siblings at night, when temperatures in the rainforest would get extremely cold. It was the afternoon, and Laylee's feet had begun to hurt, and Tien complained that he was hungry again. It had been a few hours since they last rested. The sun looked to be lowering itself in the sky, and Laylee figured it was time to set up camp once again. She handed Kristen over to Tien and asked Selene to help her pick some palm leaves from a nearby tree. Laylee took her shoes off, as it was easier to climb with bare feet, and began pulling off one leaf after another for Selene to catch below. Once they had enough, Laylee took one and folded it into a makeshift cup. They had lost Kristen's baby bottle some days ago, and it wasn't possible for their baby sister or little brother to drink from the creeks themselves. And so, seeing as they had run out of baby formula, Laylee took some water from a nearby brook, mixed some of the cassava flour into the cup, and fed the liquid to her siblings. Once they were satisfied, she and Selene began to bite and tear into the stems of the rest of the palm leaves with their teeth, before weaving and tying the leaves together with hair ties to build a shelter. But this wasn't something new for Laylee and Selene. They had made leaves into little homes before, and more importantly, they had been doing it since they were 5. Oh, not to worry, Bean. It wasn't anything as extreme as leaving the kids stranded in the wild. It was tradition. Back when they lived in their part of the jungle with their grandparents, they would play what their Aunt Damaris Mukatai called survival games with their elder family members. They would go into the forest right outside their house, and Laylee and Selene would set up small camps to live in for a few days at a time. Days in which their grandparents would instruct them on what plants to avoid, what fruit they could eat, what they needed to weave leaves together, and what things they could do to protect themselves if they ever came across a wild animal. Remembering their family was a comfort to the children as they finished building the shelter, and the children wondered if they would see their aunts, uncles, and grandparents ever again. But they weren't sure about their future with their stepfather, and without their mother, they didn't know what life was going to look like. Fatigue would soon wash over the kids as they started to settle into their little bed of palm leaves. But then, something weird caught their attention. The children could hear men shouting in the distance, but even weirder than that, they could somehow hear an eerie, distorted version of their grandmother's voice calling for them to stay put. The men found the missing plane practically standing with its nose crushed on the jungle floor, while the propeller sat some feet away in the green. Once they got closer, though, the smell of decay became obvious, and 3 bodies were found, mostly bones now, inside of the wreckage. The mother, Magdalena, the pilot, Hernando, and their escort, Herman, who had, from the looks of things, been decapitated upon impact. Finally, the mystery of what happened to the missing plane was answered, and the remains of these 3 could be given to their families for proper burial. But what they didn't expect was for every discovery to open up even more questions. Things from inside the plane were scattered around the area. Bags, clothes, and dirty diapers were everywhere, and as they took a closer look, they found even more half-eaten fruit. All of it meant one thing: the children were alive. They were clearly able to scrounge around for items to survive. "Laylee! Laylee!" the rescuers called out, yet sadly, they got no response. The men figured that the children were wandering the Amazon, and they needed any kind of support they could receive. Food packages were dropped from helicopters, and search dogs were sent out, one of which was a brown Belgian shepherd named Wilson, who will be important later. General Sanchez also figured that it was crucial to gain the kids' trust, and so he asked their maternal grandmother for recordings of her voice telling them to stay put, the audio of which would play day in and day out through speakers carried by both soldiers on foot and from helicopters surveying from the air. Leaflets written in Spanish and in the Witoto language were even scattered around the search areas to let the children know who the men were. If the children were hiding from the searchers, they needed to know that they were there to help. The leaflets had even included advice for the children on how to survive while the searchers were looking for them. Knowing that the 4 children hadn't died in the crash had given them hope, so much so that the mission was dubbed Operation Hope from then on. And General Sanchez was determined to see it through to the end. But that didn't mean the men didn't have doubts. For one thing, there was a lot of confusion over the operation. When the president mistakenly announced that the children were found, a miscommunication with the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare after the plane had been found had led them to believe that the search was over, and the military unit had to clarify that they hadn't found the children. Because of this, the public and the media called the president a liar, which certainly had an impact on the rescuers' morale, especially when the search had to continue on despite finding the plane. Where exactly were the children? And if they had heard the search team, why were they hiding? These were questions that the men would stew over during their days and nights in the jungle. On May 19th, after weeks of searching, General Sanchez felt the need to seek more spiritual guidance. I thought there was different energy in the jungle that wasn't allowing the children to be rescued. The indigenous guard was convinced it was the work of the Madre Monte, the spirit that was said to place people under a trance until they were zombie-like. It was also supposedly the very same spirit that made the rescue team incredibly sick when they began the search. The guard were skilled trackers, and their knowledge led to them finding the children's footprints. But along with their little tracks, they found something foreboding. Wherever there were footprints of the children, there were footprints of a tapir, the animal they believed to host evil spirits. And the guard believed that the Madre Monte, or the mother, and other spirits of the jungle were watching the children through this tapir. So, when General Sanchez consulted a spiritual advisor for guidance, he took 4 bottles of aguardiente, an alcoholic beverage popular in Colombia, to the Apapores River at midnight and placed them in the shape of a cross. The idea was that the alcohol would attract and please the spirits of the forest, and with luck, the offering would release the children from their hold. Yet as the days went on, the daily pouring of rain in the Amazon made it harder and harder for the men to believe they would ever find the children. Footprints were getting washed away by the 16-hour-long rainstorms, and the search dogs were losing whatever scent they had previously caught. Then, in the middle of a thunderstorm, their search dog Wilson suddenly wrestled himself out of his leash and bolted into the jungle. From time to time, he would come back to watch the soldiers from a distance, but he would never come any closer and would never stay long. It was very strange and made the rescuers wonder what had gotten into Wilson and where was he going. The brown dog had become a comforting companion for the children. They didn't know where he had come from or how it had found them, but when he first approached them, Laylee was ready to fend it off if it decided to attack her siblings. Yet the dog seemed friendly. It didn't bark at them, and before long, it stayed with the children, huddling with them under their palm shelters, keeping them warm during the cold, damp nights. Although sometimes the dog would mysteriously leave them only to return hours later. However, even with the small happiness that the dog brought them, Laylee was worried. She and her siblings were nearly skeletal. Their cassava flour had run out long ago, and all they had left to eat now were fruits and seeds from trees they would come across. It would never be enough for the children, and Laylee was afraid that with her strength draining, she wasn't going to be able to protect her siblings for much longer. She thought about the men she had seen in the forest. They had gotten close to the children the week before, and Laylee had considered yelling for help before she stopped herself. The men were armed. She remembered what her mother had told her. Rebels were threatening their family, and so Laylee couldn't trust them. There was one confusing thing though. She could still hear her grandmother's voice echoing through the trees. "Laylee, this is your grandmother. I am asking you a favor. You must remain calm and stay put." It was her grandma, so she should trust her, right? I can hear my grandma call to me, but the spirit in my mind told me not to listen. And so, Laylee and her siblings continued moving through the trees and kept evading the armed men. One day though, the dog that had been keeping them company left and didn't return. That night, the kids hunched close together as they struggled to keep away from the constant rain. It was demoralizing, and Laylee felt like she was fading away. She was so tired of all the cold and hunger that she wasn't sure if she could keep going any longer. And, admittedly, she didn't want to. So with the little energy she had left, Laylee built one last shelter where she sat with her siblings and cried. The children had given up and were ready to accept whatever fate would befall them. It was halfway through the first week of June. They had been searching for these kids for over 34 days at this point, and the men were no closer to finding them. Morale was at an all-time low, and most of the indigenous searchers had been sent back home. Only 16 of the indigenous guard searchers stayed behind in the jungle to continue the search, although they would have to leave soon. General Sanchez started having people ask him questions on why he continued the search when the assumption could be made that the children had already perished. And it was true. The odds were, at this point, even if they found the poor kids, it wasn't likely that they would find them alive. In a last-ditch effort, the indigenous volunteers asked for ayahuasca, a strong-tasting psychoactive brew of boiled Banisteriopsis capi vines, believing that ingesting it would connect them to the spirits of the forest, and that it was the only way for them to get the children back. Now, I'm not one to believe in the supernatural, and perhaps some of the soldiers weren't either, but they were at a point of trying anything to bring those kids home. And so, the hallucinogens were flown in on a charter plane to the search team, and a shelter was built for the ceremony. Once everything was ready, on June 7th, Mr. Renoki was asked to drink the psychedelic mixture, as he was the children's father. He laid down in the shelter and waited for the ayahuasca to do its, magic. And then, nothing. Mr. Renoki didn't see or hear anything, so he got up from the shelter and let the others know that the ceremony had failed. Any hope they had left was crushed. It seemed like they were out of options, and perhaps it was time for them to give up and go home. But they didn't want to do that. And just 2 days after the failed ceremony, one of the indigenous searchers, a shaman named Rubio, decided he would try the ceremony for himself. It had been a whole 40 days since the crash, and they needed it to work. So the shaman drank the ayahuasca and laid down in the ceremonial shelter. Soon, he began experiencing the side effects: vomiting, hallucinating, and convulsing. Now, normally you would panic if someone you knew started showing these symptoms, right? But for those left in the search party, they were the signs that told them Rubio had succeeded. Once Rubio was sober enough, he got up and told the others what he saw. There indeed was a spirit accompanying the children, and Rubio made a deal with it. The spirit would cast a spell on the men, and the children would be released. It was hard to believe at first. There was no guarantee that the deal would be upheld, or if there was even a spirit to have made a deal with in the first place. But then, just a couple hours later, the men began to feel incredibly sick, and coincidentally, they had the exact same flu-like symptoms and bone-aching pain from when they first arrived in the jungle. It was terrible, but it was a sacrifice the men decided was worth going through for the sake of the children. So they went on the trek through the rainforest again, despite the aches and chills. The searchers would also take Mambe again, with the goal of energizing them and keeping them connected with the spirits in the rainforest. As desperate as they were, all that was left for the indigenous searchers was their faith in their traditions, a faith that gave them one last trickle of hope through an unexpected encounter with a rare mystical creature. The men walked for hours that day with a renewed sense of purpose. It was getting late, but unlike the days and weeks before, it was bright and sunny, something they attributed to their attempts at pleasing the Madramante and other jungle spirits. They continued looking for tracks by watering holes and tree trunks, when suddenly, the indigenous volunteer named Eliezer Munoz stumbled across a rare and hopeful sight: a wish-granting tortoise.
I'm sorry, wish-granting tortoise does not compute. Are my audio senses malfunctioning? Or perhaps your central processing system is experiencing a critical error.
Well, the Witoto people believe that the red-footed tortoise is a creature that has the ability to grant someone wishes. All you had to do was release it from capture once the wish was fulfilled. As for Munoz, as soon as he found the tortoise, he grabbed some palm leaves nearby and wrapped the tortoise in a makeshift cage. "All right, Turtle, you're going to help me find the kids," he informed the tortoise as he carried it along. "You either help me, or I'll eat your liver." It's unclear whether it was because of Munoz's new search companion, the rituals, or just pure coincidence, but as the men continued through the rainforest, something odd would catch their attention. They had initially considered heading back once the sun set, but that day was different. They wanted to believe in Rubio's vision, and they were determined to find the children that day. It was now or never. Then, just 10 minutes after capturing the tortoise, they heard a faint whimper. At first, it sounded like it could have been a monkey's cry or a bird's caw. Yet as they stood still to listen more closely, all their doubts disappeared. It was the whimper of a human baby. One of the men spotted some leaves used to form a canopy some distance away, where a pair of eyes peeked through the green. At long last, they found the children. However, it was immediately evident that they did not trust the men. Laylee and Selene attempted to run away with Kristen in their arms, prompting the men to corral the young girls and try to convince them that they knew their family. And luckily, it worked. "I'm hungry," was the first thing Laylee said to her rescuers. The men then asked where Tien was, to which Laylee pointed to a small shelter some distance away, where he was laying on a bed of leaves. The young boy was too malnourished to even move. "My mom is dead," he told the men, then asked for bread and sausages. With the children too weak to walk and the forest too dense for the rescue helicopter to land, the men carried them on their backs to the base. Meanwhile, Munoz released the red-footed tortoise, thanking it repeatedly for granting his request. After a grueling 40 days of searching, all 4 children were finally going home. Miracle! 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 The men shouted over the radio as they returned with the children. General Sanchez began crying as soon as he heard the news. Laylee and her siblings had only been 3 miles away from the crash site, which meant the rescuers had somehow passed them during their search, perhaps more than once, probably because they were high on drugs. The rest of the rescuers knew that the children severely needed something to eat and drink. However, after such a long time without solid food, their stomachs would have gone into shock if they ate solid food right away, so instead, they gave them vitamin-rich serums. Mr. Inoki rushed over to see his children with tears in his eyes, while Rubio performed a ritual over the children with tobacco smoke to cleanse them from any jungle spirits still clinging to them. And by nightfall, they were flown to a hospital in Bogota, where they would spend a month in recovery. The children were rescued, but that didn't mean that their troubles were over. For one thing, the soldiers still had to find Wilson. When the children recounted their experience in the jungle, they told the soldiers of the dog that had found them, and how he had kept them company for a while. The rescuers had seen Wilson about 100 feet away the day before they found the children, but then the rescue dog ran away and hadn't been seen since, so the soldiers decided to dedicate the rest of the month to searching for him. He was the true hero, said the military during an interview. Unfortunately, the rainy weather continued to hinder any operations they had in the jungle, and Wilson has sadly not been seen to this day. As for Laylee and her siblings, they would be taken by Colombia's Child Protection Agency. As fortunate as they were to have food to eat and a bed to sleep in, it appeared that their home wasn't the warm and safe place the public had hoped for the children to return to. While the children were recovering, Laylee and Seleni's biological father wanted them, while their stepfather, Mr. Inoki, wanted to take custody of Tien and Kristen. Meanwhile, Magdalena's parents were completely opposed to both fathers, advocating for the children to be kept together, and their reasons were shocking to say the least. The reason the children and their mother had flown in that plane in the first place was to move in with Mr. Inoki. It was supposed to be safer with him, but the truth was, Mr. Inoki wasn't known to be a kind man. Magdalena's parents had claimed to see Magdalena frequently cry over phone calls with him, and apparently he had been seen cheating on her with his ex-wife multiple times. Worse than that, he also allegedly had a history of violence, even going so far as hitting Magdalena with a machete and beating the children enough that Laylee hid in the forest with her siblings for 3 days to protect them from the beatings when Mr. Inoki arrived home with alcohol breath and started hitting them without mercy. The most damning argument against Mr. Inoki, though, was the accusation that he had been sexually abusing Laylee. Once the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare heard of the accusations, they didn't allow him to see Laylee and Selene while they were in the hospital. And by August, just a little over a month after the children were released from medical care, Mr. Inoki was arrested on charges of sexual abuse. It's a bittersweet outcome for the children who had no parents to turn to, yes, but the uncertainty of their future would always contain hope. With General Sanchez becoming the godfather of Kristen, he would also continue visiting the children to see how they were doing with their new caretakers in Bogota. They would prefer to be eating farina and live in Araraquara, Sanchez said in an interview. Yet with Kristen starting to walk, Tien playing with Lego, and Selene and Laylee being homeschooled, it was clear that things were on the way to getting better, and perhaps in time, they would find a permanent, happy home, wherever it was going to be. Be sure to hit subscribe and the thumbs up. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos, like this one about the creatures that crawl into people's ears while they sleep, and how to stop it from happening to you.